Donald Trump has announced that his country will take over the Gaza Strip and that Palestinians living there could be resettled elsewhere. The US president made the comments at a press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. Mr. Netanyahu says the proposal is worth pursuing and that it could change history. In the Palestinian territories, Mr. Trump's comments have caused shock and outrage. The militant group Hamas in Gaza and Palestinian leaders in the West Bank have rejected the proposals. So too have several countries, including some key US allies.
The Gaza Strip, a total of about 360 square kilometers of land, faced relentless bombardment from Israel for over 15 months. Now it's confronting another kind of threat, a foreign leader toying with the idea of occupation.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll do what is necessary. If it's necessary, we'll do that. We're going to take over that piece, and we're going to develop it.
While the U.S. president considers the Gaza Strip to be real estate on sale, its residents reject his plans strongly.
Trump's remarks are illogical. We have lived through war for a year and more. And then he comes and says we should leave our land. This is our land and the land of our ancestors.
This call for displacement is not new. Many plans talked about this issue and failed. Of course, the plan of US President Donald Trump will fail because Gazans hold on to their land, country and soil of their nation. Many wars passed on Palestine and specifically Gaza and did not let the Palestinian people to migrate or travel to other countries.
Palestinian leadership too voiced outrage over the US president's comments.
These statements reflect confusion and deep ignorance about Palestine and the region. Gaza is certainly not a common land, and it is not property that can be bought and sold.
Hamas is regarded by the US and the European Union as a terrorist organization. However, it has governed the Gaza Strip since 2007. Hamas also called on Arab and Muslim leaders to hold an emergency meeting and sent a clear message that Trump's position on Gaza would not be accepted in the region. The US president's remarks could threaten the ceasefire deal too, which itself is a balancing act for all sides. Trump's statement has already drawn sharp international condemnation.
China has always believed that Palestinians governing Palestine is the basic principle of post-war governance of Gaza. We oppose the forced relocation of people in Gaza and hope that relevant parties will take the ceasefire and what comes after it as an opportunity to push the Palestinian issue back on the right track and achieve lasting peace in the Middle East.
Australia, Turkey, Russia and others issued similar comments on Wednesday. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry posted a statement saying Saudi Arabia would continue efforts to establish an independent Palestinian state. It echoed previous similar statements from other Arab nations that the two-state solution was the prerequisite for these countries to establish diplomatic relations with Israel.
Mary Ellen O'Connell is a professor of law and of international peace studies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. She joins us from South Bend in the state of Indiana. Welcome to DW. Do you see any way that the US could do this legally?
Yes, it could do what President Trump has suggested legally with the consent of the Palestinian people. But I've seen no indication that there's any interest among the Palestinian people in transferring their sovereignty and their territory to the United States, as President Trump called it, ownership. It would be great if a consensual agreement in which the U.S. provides substantial aid to rebuild Gaza and to even rebuild the West Bank and create the Riviera of the Middle East. I'm sure everyone would like that, as long as it's under the wishes, under the control of the Palestinian people.
Right. So there could be a carrot and or stick in this, couldn't there? There could be, well, if you don't let us do this, we'll just let you live with the rubble around you. Or perhaps if you do agree, we'll give you certain inducements.
Well, I hate to think of this particular situation as that kind of a bargain, although I think the way you put it would appeal to President Trump. He likes to talk about international affairs in those deal-making ways. But the Palestinian people have certain inherent rights, certain human rights to self-determination, to live in a situation that is supportive of their right to life, their right to be family members, their right to their cultural heritage. All of this has been destroyed through unlawful use of force, extensive use of force, and the U.S. has played a role in that, in providing offensive weapons to Israel, which have been used in violation of international humanitarian law. So from the international law perspective, as opposed to the art of the deal perspective, the Palestinian people are within their rights to demand that the U.S. provide support as a remedy for the U.S.'s role in the destruction of Gaza in helping to rebuild it. And on behalf of the international community, to rebuild the priceless cultural heritage that has been so vastly destroyed, to protect the environment, to create, and honestly, that is the way to peace.
There's lots of moving parts to this suggestion, wild as it is, because let's say that he gets the Gazans to agree to that. Then he then has to talk to the neighbouring countries like Egypt and Jordan and say to them, accept these people. Now, they've already said this deal is a non-starter. How could he pressure them into accepting relocated Gazans?
Well, I would have said 2 weeks ago, or before President Trump was inaugurated, that countries were going to stand together in support of the rule of law, cooperate with each other, and send the message that it's international law that guides international relations, not particular deals that President Trump comes up with late at night. However, we've seen, for example, in the case of Colombia, when they were trying to stand up to prevent inhumane flights of people handcuffed who had not been accused of crimes, were not part of the criminal justice system in deportation flights. But Colombia seems to have stepped back and not stood strong for that support of human rights. So, yes, President Trump seems to have a way to get answers he wants, at least in the short term. I'm hoping that in this particular situation, there is actually some good in what President Trump said. Yes, Gaza has been made unlivable. Yes, there should be a way forward to make it livable, to make it a prosperous, wonderful place where tourism brings money for people, where a peaceful way of life is possible. So let's build on that in a cooperative way. Emergency housing, aid brought to the region. All of the countries need to refuse to do these side deals with the president.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell from the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you.
Well, Lynn Boylan is a member of the European Parliament and chairs the EU Delegation for Relations with Palestine. She gave me her reaction to President Trump's proposal.
Well, I think the statement made by President Trump overnight is deeply, deeply concerning from an international law perspective, from a human rights perspective. We know that President Trump is very closely aligned to Benjamin Netanyahu, but I don't think anybody expected him to make the statement that he did last night. So it's very, very concerning. And I think that the EU now is at a crossroads in terms of how it's going to approach the situation with Palestine and whether or not it is going to decide that it needs to stand up for international law and multilateralism.
OK, we'll come to that. Can you see this idea getting any support in the European Parliament or indeed the Commission?
Well, unfortunately, within the European Parliament, there are members who are very pro-Benjamin Netanyahu's government. There are those who are very pro-President Trump. So absolutely, there will be individual MEPs in the Parliament who will have no problem with this statement and no problem endorsing it. For the European Commission and the European institutions itself, it is about whether or not they are opposed to ethnic cleansing. It's whether or not they are in favour of upholding upholding international law, and that's the position which I want to see the institutions take, and to come out and to forthrightly condemn these statements, but also, as I said, to stand up for international law. We're at a critical juncture here where we are seeing consistently the ICJ, the ICC, the UN all being undermined, and it's up to the EU to defend those institutions.
Ethnic cleansing. Mr. Trump hasn't talked about any forcible removal of Palestinians from Gaza. So where does that come from?
Well, I suppose, look, I was just returned from Cairo. I was there over the weekend meeting some of the 120,000 displaced Gazaoans there. And the one thing that the message they wanted to take back was they want to go home. They want to return back to Gaza. That is their homeland. Unfortunately, at the moment, they don't even have houses, physical houses to go back to. But they were all adamant, Gaza is their homeland, Palestine is their homeland, and that's where they want to return to. So Donald Trump's statements are really concerning in that how does he plan to impose this on people? It's in violation of international law, and that's where the EU must come out, condemn his statement, and to say under absolutely no circumstances are we going to allow a situation where Palestinian people will be forcibly displaced from their land any further than they already have been. They need to be allowed to return. Gaza needs to be rebuilt with support from the EU and from other international partners, and the occupied territories need to end. Israel needs to end its illegal occupation.
Thanks for joining us. Lynn Boylan, Chair of the EU Delegation for Relations with Palestine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we have some more on that now from Shalom Lipner. He spent 26 years working under 7 consecutive Israeli prime ministers and is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. I asked him if Trump's controversial plans for Gaza were in line with international law.
Well, the devil is certainly going to be in the details. I mean, last night, President Trump gave us a surreal performance, very ambitious. It's not clear that at this point, we galley only one particular issue here. There's as you implied, there's a huge amount of resistance, shall we say, to this in the world and the region closer at hand. The logistics are very complicated. The president has been very clear up until this point, at least, that he's looking to sort of invest less in, boots and treasure in the Middle East and maybe focus on issues at home. So whether or not he actually is going to go through with this, what it actually looks like, I think there are a whole series of questions that still remain at this point.
But merely on the basis of what he has said, talking about resettling people out of Gaza, something that the Jordanians and the Egyptians have said they will not accept, for example, would this not fall under the definition of forced displacement, something that is considered illegal under international law?
Look, I'm not a lawyer. Ultimately, like everything else, it would depend on what that looked like. I mean, he and other people who have talked about plans like this talk about, offering people the ability to, to relocate. I don't know if that's what it would like or wouldn't look like. Clearly, there are other scenarios which
Gazans don't want to relocate. Gazans don't want to relocate.
I have heard that. I'm not suggesting that they do or don't. I'm just saying in terms of the actual specifics, whether or not it will actually or will not be legal at the end will probably depend on what the specifics of what we're looking at are, if it even comes to that point.
Whatever we are seeing at the moment, how much support do you think there will be in Israel for a plan such as this?
I mean, the Israeli public has been interesting, certainly up till last night's meeting and even further. I mean, there's been this sort of pendulum between euphoria and being panic-stricken about what could actually come down the pike. So, clearly there are elements, especially within the prime minister's government, which will be excited about some of what they've heard. Not about everything. I mean, it will be equivocal. Again, from their perspective, right, there are issues with how the hostage deal does or does not progress to future phases, what that would imply for the other goals that the prime minister elucidated in terms of the war, in terms of, the future of Hamas, whether it would actually remain in Gaza, what that would look like. So, I mean, by and large, I think they're excited about the prospect of what Trump was talking about. Whether or not that happens is a separate question. But like everything else, I think people, just to go back historically quickly, I think that there was, at the time, great excitement by some quarters in Israel initially by his deal of the century during his last tenure. And then many were surprised to discover that when he actually tabled it, there was pushback from some of those same quarters who didn't like all the details. So, everything will depend on the specifics when we get that far.
But this idea of moving Palestinians out of Gaza, isn't this a plan that has traditionally been supported by the ultra-nationalists in Israel?
Yes, very much. That's what I'm saying. Those are precisely the elements I'm talking about within his government. I think that, it certainly does speak to a broader swath, depending on what it would look like. And when people are thinking about what would happen, what could be a solution for Gaza, I think the president did tap into a degree of public sentiment when he talked about the fact that everything has been tried historically and that over and over again, we're back in the same morass, shall we say, in Gaza. So whether or not this is the solution or another solution, I think that there are plenty of people, maybe even beyond that particular swath of the public, that are interested in, talking about what else could happen, whether it would be this or something else is a separate issue.
The Arab world in general appears to be against the plan. We were talking about the Jordanians and the Egyptians earlier. Saudi Arabia has said that there is no possibility of any normalization of ties with Israel at the cost of a future Palestinian state. Why suggest a plan like this if countries in the region aren't on board?
Well, at the end of the day, it's not surprising in the context of which that President Trump and other people presumably will put things on the table which advance their interests as they see them. Again, this is just, he may put this out there and say he has said this is what's going to happen. But certainly if we look at other things that are playing out in Canada and Mexico and South America, we've seen him put a lot of things out there only to pull back and say, well, we'll wait a month, we'll negotiate. From his perspective as a businessman, as he reminds us all the time, it's hard necessarily to say it will look like this, it won't look like this. I was recalling this morning that in his last tenure, when the Abraham Accords came to pass, part of the backdrop to that was that it had actually been that the Emiratis, I believe, had said publicly that in their mind, the Accords came to swap out plans for annexation. So, we don't yet know actually, but maybe even in Trump's thinking, he's putting this out there as an idea and hoping to move other levers in response, not necessarily this one, but it's a little bit early to know exactly what's going to happen.
Where does that leave negotiations on the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire?
It's an excellent question. The president has said he's still committed to it. The prime minister reinforced what he said about getting all the hostages out. The implication of your question being that would ostensibly conflict with some of the other objectives they put out there. That may be true. Prime Minister said after his meeting with the president's envoy this week that he was dispatching a team to Doha. We don't necessarily yet know what their mandate will be, whether it's involving the implementation of the current phase, whether it's the next phase. I think a lot of these things will ultimately be determined. The issue of a second phase of the deal, as all these other issues, a lot will depend on whether, to what extent the president wants to employ carrots and sticks at his disposal. Before he was elected, he could get away with rhetoric, but now people will be watching to see for the seriousness of his intentions.
Shalom, Lipner from the Atlantic Council think tank. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, I want to go now to Balig Sladeen. He's a journalist in Tel Aviv. Balig, good to see you. Let's start with where you are. What has the reaction been inside Israel?
Well, I would say that definitely the Israeli public and also inside the political arena has welcomed these statements by Donald Trump. I don't think that the Israelis can think of anything better than this, especially after October 7th, the issue with Gaza, the problem with Gaza, the threat that Gaza has been imposing on Israel since the Hamas's takeover and also before that is a major thing in Israel. And a recent polling has said that 80% of Israelis see that this is either practical and this should happen, or at least they wish that it could happen, which means that absolutely they support it. Inside the political arena, we've heard Ben-Gvir, the far-right Israeli former minister, saying that now he's thinking about going back to the Israeli coalition and the Israeli government. And Bezalel Smotrich has said that this is only the beginning, which suggests that he already had some indication that this is actually the plan. But interestingly enough, we haven't heard anything from the Israeli opposition, from Gantz, from Lapid, the head of the opposition. And it's because maybe their voters do think that this plan should be considered at least. But of course, Israeli allies in Europe and the Middle East don't think that this is a good plan. They see it even as a crime.
Let me pick up on that, Balig. Can we say that this idea was agreed upon by Netanyahu and Trump before the press conference yesterday?
Well, definitely we can assume that, especially that Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who is very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, also close to the Republican Party, has been holding meetings with the Trump officials even before they took office, before the inauguration on January 20th. And he had been also discussing post-war Gaza with the Emiratis and also the Trump officials even before that. And this means that this plan has been in place, or at least even if we consider this plan to be rhetorical only in order to push Hamas, push Egypt, and push the Arab world in general to find a solution to Gaza, and not to push Israelis and pressure Israelis to give concessions in terms of post-war Gaza. Still, it's very reasonable to think that this plan is has been coordinated between the sides.
So how realistic then is Trump's proposal? And if Israel were to support it, I mean, what would this do to the greater Middle East?
Well, I think that this plan is, at least at this point, difficult to see it happening. But definitely, if Trump is saying that the Egyptians and the Jordanians and also other countries will be accepting Gaza, then we should also consider this as happening in the future or the near future, even if it's not the 1.8 million Palestinians being transferred outside of Gaza, but at least some of them, that it by itself would put pressure on Hamas to give concessions in the discussions about post-war Gaza. And also the fact that 44% of Palestinians, according to recent polling from June 2024 by Fathi Shkaki, who is a very notable pollster in the Palestinian territories, say that the Palestinians in Gaza do consider actually migrating outside of Gaza, which means that it is still, of course, needs the other side to accept those Palestinians, but at least half of them will be willing to actually migrate outside of Gaza.
You know, Balig, this story, of course, overshadowing the fact that today we were supposed to be talking about the second phase of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. How does that ceasefire look now?
Listening to every single word?
Well, I don't think we can unlink the two, because after all, the second phase of the deal and the third phase of the deal means that we will be discussing also post-war Gaza. This is the whole issue. Well, definitely Hamas wants to see Israel declaring the end of the war and also withdrawing all of its forces from the Gaza Strip, and then they will keep on holding at least some of the hostages, bodies of hostages, until the reconstruction of Gaza is completed. But on the other side, the Israelis don't have cards anymore if they do, or wouldn't have cards if they do declare the end of the war and pull out completely from Gaza. And now we see that this is happening right now, especially in this time, because the Israelis want to hold also some of the cards that will pressure Hamas, which is, of course, migrating or deporting or relocating, it depends on how you want to describe it, of Palestinians outside of Gaza, which means that this is absolutely part of this whole negotiation that apparently already officially started at least, but the Israeli delegation will travel to Qatar by this weekend in order to formally start with the talks, and the plan to deport Palestinians or relocate Palestinians will be definitely on the table, again, in order to pressure Hamas to give its concession and give up on governing Gaza. And if that happens, then the Israeli Prime Minister can declare victory in this war, bringing back all the hostages and, of course, getting Hamas down from power in Gaza. And the third, the most important, I guess, goal, which is ensuring that Gaza in the future will not impose any threat on the Israelis.
Journalist Balig Sladeen with the latest from Tel Aviv. Balig, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, our coverage continues now with Marc Weller. He's a professor of international law and international constitutional studies at the University of Cambridge. He has also served as a UN senior mediation expert. It's good to have you with us. Let me just ask you, the U.S. president saying that the U.S. would take over the Gaza Strip, is he speaking with any legal authority to do that?
No, he is speaking without any legal authority whatever. It sounds like he is thinking in terms of his domestic practice as a property tycoon who can take over some derelict wasteland and turn it into a Florida-like oasis. But here, of course, it's not an empty territory. This is territory which belongs to Palestine either as a state, if you think it is a state already, or as a self-determination entity, which means an entity that is entitled to form a state on all the Palestinian territories, which includes Gaza. And nobody else can dispose of these territories. Israel has no right to dispose of it, and Mr. Trump has absolutely no claim to saying, as he said, we own it, or we will own it, or we will take it over. So that is entire fantasy.
Well, Mr. Boylan, what would the legal implications be then if the president were to try to act on this idea, take over Gaza, and then pursue mass relocation of Gazans?
Well, relocation is a kind word for what would be the forced displacement of the Gazans and the Palestinians. This is a large segment of a population that is entitled to self-determination, ultimately to statehood. So this would be a violation of that right. It would be a violation of the laws of war, because at the moment Israel is an occupying power in that territory, and under the laws of armed conflict it is absolutely prohibited to remove an entire population permanently from the territory it has historically inhabited. And of course, the Palestinians have human rights. They are people like you and I, and they enjoy the protection of the international legal system. Mm-hmm. Indeed, some would argue that this would amount to ethnic cleansing, which we saw in the former Yugoslavia and other territories. The idea that you can solve an international problem by moving an entire ethnic population out of it, which certainly Europe would reject very strongly.
The president was pressed on this yesterday. He replied, and I'm quoting here, I don't think the Palestinians are going to tell me no. How do you interpret that? Does that say what you've been saying, that this would be forced displacement?
Well, it's difficult to see any other way. The Palestinians are quite attached to their national aim of actualizing their state. To do that, there have to be Palestinians in Palestine. And it doesn't seem likely that they would wish to voluntarily leave their own territory. You could say that, yes, you might encourage them by payments, making it attractive to move, and some might, or you could say to the opposite, that continued harsh occupation by Israel might make it more attractive for them to leave, but that would then come quite close to forced displacement.
A key U.S. ally in the region, Saudi Arabia, has already rejected Trump's proposal. It has reiterated its support for a Palestinian state. Do you think that Donald Trump's long sought-after normalization of relations between these two countries, has he put that in jeopardy now?
Yes, he has. If he seriously pursues this idea, it will be very difficult to Arab states not to oppose this quite strongly. I think they would face protests and possibly risks to their own stability if they were to somehow come close to this idea. In particular, Jordan, I think, would be under some threat, which already has a very large Palestinian population. And if you add another million or so to that, due to this idea of moving them on into some other state, that would be a very serious risk.
Professor Marc, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you.